The Prime Minister has said taxes would be cut in a responsible way and that his government would now focus on growing the economy. Is it too little too late? Joining me now, Economist Julian Jessop is with us. Julian, good afternoon to you. They always use that horrible phrase, rabbits out of hats and stuff like that. I mean, is Jeremy Hunt likely to pull some huge beast out of that hat to placate those voters that are thinking of legging it elsewhere? Because after all, this will be one of the last financial statements before our next election.
Well, I think that's the right way to look at this. This is partly about economics, but frankly, it's mainly about politics. And I think the political pressure for some meaningful tax cuts is now becoming irresistible. So I think we may well get something a bit more than expected on Wednesday. I think the one thing that's guaranteed is some cuts in business tax. In particular, there's a policy called full expensing, which is basically a tax break for investment. I think that will be extended and potentially made permanent. But I think what most people will be interested in is what he might do on personal tax. There has been this idea of reducing or maybe abolishing inheritance tax. That now seems to be off the agenda. But instead, he might do something more meaningful on personal tax in terms of income tax or national insurance, perhaps raising the threshold at which we start to pay those taxes, which would be a tax cut for pretty much everybody.
What about things like stamp duty, one of the most extraordinary, inexplicable taxes? I'm sure if you had the time and the effort and the money, you could probably mobilise a legal case against it. It's so bizarre, but it exists for the audacity of moving house and buying another one. Here's a big fat tax bill. They've tinkered with it before, of course. They've had sort of honeymoon periods of getting rid of it. Is that likely to feature?
Well, I think people are a bit bored with cuts in stamp duty. I, like you, would like to see it abolished completely, but I don't think there'll be much political bang for that buck. So I think he will look elsewhere at things that really do grab the headlines, and I think probably income tax on national insurance has to be the winner there. I wouldn't completely rule out something on inheritance tax. I mean, this is a difficult sell. It is a tax that's only paid by a small minority of people, but I think he could make a decent case that this is a measure that would boost investment as well. I mean, a lot of the reasons why people set up businesses and buy assets is to hand on that money to future generations, to their children. And if there's a big tax penalty for doing so, we get less investment in the economy, and that's bad for everybody. So I wouldn't completely rule out inheritance tax, but I think for political effect, he really has to go for income tax and national insurance.
Yeah, and I think you're probably right. I mean, inheritance tax, you can create some obvious moral arguments or ethical arguments around it. I get that. But in terms of selling it, people want to hear something tangible, right? They want to hear an amount. They want to hear a figure where they can go, right, OK, let me just work that out. 5/4, yeah, I can do that. That means I'm going to be, 600 quid a year better off, £200 a month, whatever it is. It's got to be something like that, Julian, hasn't it? Even just tinkering around with a little bit of income tax doesn't always cut it.
Exactly. It's about the direction of travel as well. So putting clear blue water, if you like, between the Conservatives and Labour. So even if it might just be a small cut in income tax now, a small increase in the threshold at which you start paying it, he could signal his intention to do more in future. So it's sort of down payment on what would happen if you vote Conservative in the next election and they're re-elected.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the term meaningful tax cuts. That depends on where you're standing, I guess, doesn't it? Is meaningful looking at people at the lowest end at the moment? Is it about 12,000 quid you pay no tax or something of that region? There's very that started really with the coalition sort of upping it. It has increased over the years. Some people say that should go much higher before you begin paying tax, and I think to most people, certainly on paper, that sounds completely reasonable. Those right at the top always create a very persuasive argument that actually, if you break it down, they pay a mammoth amount of tax. A huge percentage of the overall tax contributions comes from the highest earners. But it's that group in the middle who keep being dipped into the higher rate of tax. It's areas like that that might be the crucial zone for the Chancellor to look at.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are good arguments, I think, for raising the sort of entry level at which you start to pay income tax, but also the level just above that when you start to pay the higher rates. So an awful lot of people who, they're not fabulously wealthy, they're sort of, maybe senior teachers, for example, who are now paying much more tax than they would otherwise have done. I wouldn't regard that, by the way, as a giveaway, as some people describe it. I think it's more a give back. So the Treasury has ended up making a lot more money than anticipated because inflation and prices and therefore wages have been higher than anticipated. So an awful lot more people are now paying high rates of tax than they were before. So that's an obvious anomaly in the system to correct. I also think there's an awful lot of things he could do for other people who are paying very, very high marginal rates of tax somewhere in the middle because the tax system has got so complicated and bloated. So there's a lot of tidying up he could do that wouldn't actually cost the Treasury a lot of money, but could impact some people quite a lot and maybe